We bring in the insiders because we have some big news across the National Hockey League. We welcome in Chris Johnston and Elliotte Friedman for some instant analysis. And here's what we know. The NHL on Friday disclosing that since they began Phase 2 on June 8th, they tested more than 200 NHL players. And gentlemen, 11 of those players have come back with positive COVID tests, according to the National Hockey League. So what does this mean? How detrimental could this be, theoretically, to the return of the National Hockey League? Start with you, Elliotte.
David, there's no question this was a seismic day. The news in the NHL. Look, also, who else got affected by positive tests today? Major League Baseball, golf, the National Football League, and we heard 23 football players at Clemson tested positive too. I mean, it's a huge day. And, you know, in the social media age, it's like missiles hitting their target, one after the other, and it leads to huge reaction. You know, the league had a conference call with the general managers tonight, and I think the word is, let's see where this goes. I don't think there's any movement at this point in time to change the opening of camps for July 10th. I think they've set it so that the final day of the Stanley Cup final, if it happens on schedule, will be October the 5th. However, you know, there's still 3 weeks until this has to happen. So I think we're going to see where this goes, but there's no question a lot of people were shaken by the news today, Chris.
Well, and I think there's some, hope, Elliotte, in this that, maybe it's a bit of a wake-up call for players. I mean, obviously everyone knows how serious this is, and there's no suggestion necessarily that these players that have tested positive are doing anything wrong. But, I think it underlines the importance also of the talks that have been going on with the NHL and the NHL Players Association about the protocols that will govern when training camps open, Phase 3, and when the competition goes, and lets us know why this bubble will probably have to be very tightly controlled if the NHL is to restart its season. At this point, it's basically a 5% rate in terms of those that participate in Phase 2 that have produced a positive test. That's not that far off what the average would be. And the hope is, as time went along, that would be reduced. But once you get players involved in the system, so to speak, when they're being tested regularly, obviously any positive tests being separated from the group, that this is still something that can be brought under control and can allow the season to finish as hoped.
David, I do think you're going to see the league and more the Players Association at this point just remind people that just because in your area others may not be taking social distancing seriously, if you have any desire to play, you have to.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this could be a wake-up call to any players who were taking it a little bit lighter than we should. And if they're turning on the local news and the national news, they wouldn't be taking this lightly, because we're seeing upwards of 20 states spiking in the wrong direction. One of those teams impacted by the news today of these positive COVID tests, the Tampa Bay Lightning, Tampa in Florida. Arizona is another state under siege. Texas. There are a lot of states. Meanwhile, in Canada, the numbers have been reduced. That being the case, Chris, is there a greater likelihood now that one and maybe even possibly two, both of the hubs could be based in Canada?
Well, there's certainly a much greater likelihood. In fact, it's a possibility, and I wouldn't have even said that, 2 weeks ago, that we might see both hub cities for this restart be based in Canada. I think a lot of it underlines why the league wanted to take its time before committing once and for all, because I don't think anything's changed in that the league is like Las Vegas as a potential destination for one of these hubs from the beginning. It's probably been the favorite if we want to, sort of treat it like a race. But because of some of the things that have gone on in the U.S., I think that there's, certainly a conversation around that. You look at somewhere like Alberta, where there's virtually no cases at the moment, and Edmonton being, one of the options in the Canadian cities. You got Vancouver there. Even Toronto, I think, is viewed favorably. And on Friday, the Canadian government came out and signed off on the NHL's plans to try to use one or maybe two of these cities as possibilities. So I would say, as we look for that decision to be made in the next few days, all of a sudden now 2 Canadian hubs is certainly a possibility. I don't know that I would go as far to call it a likelihood, because I do think Vegas is still an intriguing option that the NHL is looking at. But, all of this stuff matters, and on a day-by-day basis, things can change, as we've seen here in the last few days.
You're hearing the same things, I imagine, Elliotte.
Yeah, I would say that's true. I mean, I'm like Chris. If you would have told me a month ago that there would be 2 Canadian hubs, I would have laughed in your face. But now I think we all have to consider the possibility it could actually happen.
And listen, the National Hockey League has been steadfast since day one that they're not going to compromise the health of any of their players or any of the staffing in the National Hockey League. That's their number one criteria, their number one concern. If that's the case, then certainly right now advantage to the Canadian hubs that are vying to be hosting some of these Stanley Cup playoffs when there is a resumption. Last question I have for you gentlemen has to do with the schedule, the next 2 weeks. There's a lot to get done. Elliotte, walk us through exactly what they're trying to hammer home to ensure that we can have a resumption of play.
Well, Dave, while you've been sitting on your back porch sipping pina coladas, the various lawyers for these two entities, the League and the Players Association, have been grinding away at both the protocols for the training camps and the games, and also it won't be the full CBA. It'll be a framework or a memorandum of understanding. And if we are going to start on July the 10th, you can't just vote on July the 7th. I think they want the players voting by the end of June so they can, and every player will get to vote. Because it's a CBA issue, all players will vote, even those who are not necessarily playing in the playoffs, they all vote. The question is if it's going to be one vote or two. It might just be one big one because the protocols in the CBA could all be tied together. So I think that's what they're grinding towards, is getting all of that done so the players can vote on it in the next 10 days. And you know, Kevin Bieksa raised some interesting questions this week. I think we all have a lot of questions after today. I think we're going to know the answer to a lot of these questions by the end of June, and that is, are the players willing to play under both the health and financial circumstances that are placed in front of them?
Well, and I would say this, Elliotte, that we're at the point where I'm confident saying that there's no way there's a return to play this summer if those CBA issues aren't ironed out. And a lot of players have said, there was a call here this week with the NHLPA's executive board, although all players were welcome on it. And a lot of the players want to have an idea what kind of financial stake or what the circumstances are around this return, not just for this year, but the next couple seasons, how that will shake out while evaluating whether this is quote unquote worth it for them. And so, I think it makes a lot of sense. Both parties recognize the importance of doing that. And that's why a lot of that work's kind of been going on beneath the surface here the last few weeks. And there's a pretty big deadline, as Elliotte points out, looming over those talks.
100 days since the pause, and still so many hurdles, so much logistics still to be worked out. Inching forward, but maybe on Friday, a little bit of a step backwards with all the news surrounding the positive COVID case. Thanks again to our insiders, Chris Johnston, Elliotte Friedman, for this instant analysis.